All right, well, welcome to Blue Cypress Books for another Creative Community League's Author Talk. I'm Amy Irvin, your host and moderator for today's Author Talk offered by Creative Community League, an initiative utilizing cultural strategies for movement building, supporting artists, storytelling, and other dynamic community involvement, and moving reproductive and sexual awareness into creative spaces. See our website, Facebook, and Instagram pages for all of our projects. The Author Talk series hosts authors and academics writing about issues important to women and families in Louisiana and the Gulf South. Past guests include poet Ann Babson, author Robin Marty, and doctors Maeve Wallace and Carissa Hagerberg, both of Tulane University. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Deshawn Taylor, an Arizona-based award-winning gynecologist and family planning specialist who sees patients at the Desert Star Institute for Family Planning, an independent abortion clinic in Phoenix. Her book, Undue Burden, a Black woman physician on being Christian and pro-abortion in the reproductive justice movement, provides a new prism from which to address the attack on abortion rights in America. Born and raised and trained in Los Angeles, California, Dr. Taylor has called Arizona home for 14 years. She earned a Doctor of Medicine degree at David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, completed OBGYN training at King Drew Medical Center, and complex family planning training at the University of Southern California, where she was also conferred a Master of Science degree in clinical and biomedical investigations. Thank you so much for joining us in New Orleans today. We're glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
So, in a recent report, Abortion Care Network noted that 23 independently owned clinics closed this year, on top of the 42 that shuttered in 2022, leaving over a dozen states, mainly in the American South and Midwest, without a single brick-and-mortar clinic that provides abortion. How did the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, impact your medical practice at the Desert Star Family Planning Clinic in Phoenix? How have you kept the clinic open this last year?
So thank you for referencing the Abortion Care Network report, because the Abortion Care Network is the only organization that's tracking closures of independent clinics. And actually, this year they also accounted for clinics that didn't necessarily close their doors, but were not providing abortion care. And so when you look at that number, then you have 65 clinics. And that's significant because they still exist in number, but not in practice. And so there's 14 states that don't have an actual abortion provider because of that. And so in Arizona, my clinic was almost a casualty, because with the Dobbs decision, there was a web of laws in Arizona that were already making providing care very restrictive, and access had already diminished prior to that decision. And so the laws that went into effect after Roe v. Wade was overturned just made it even more difficult to practice. I like to say we limped out of COVID into the Dobbs decision, because there were already clinics that were suffering and having trouble staying open due to the COVID pandemic. And so one of the things that kept the clinic open was a strong desire for me to maintain services, because once an independent clinic closes, they don't open back up. And so I shrank the number of days the clinic operated to account for the number of staff available to provide services. There was a loss of staff concerned about their jobs and whether the clinic could stay open after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And we saw that happening across the country. And so we were able to continue to maintain a lower level of service without closing, because of some of those hard decisions that I made about operating less days, to be able to continue to serve. And then ultimately, the clinic was sold to the nonprofit that I also founded 6 years ago to be able to maintain services. So that clinic is no longer solo owned by me. It belongs to the community now, and the services are being transferred to a nonprofit.
Well, all three abortion clinics in Louisiana closed following the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs. Furthermore, there are no exceptions for rape or incest, and there's been a delayed care for women seeking medical care for miscarriage or non-viable pregnancies. What are the current laws pertaining to abortion in Arizona, and how are abortion bans impacting patient care for all pregnant people?
So in Arizona, it's a very convoluted situation there. There's been a lot of litigation and court decisions that put us in the place that we are today, which is that abortion care can happen up to 15 weeks of pregnancy. And so there is a case regarding the 1864 total ban that is still on the books in Arizona that is currently not being enforced due to a court order. That case is going to be heard in the Arizona Supreme Court this month.
Oh, wow. So
there is still a possibility that abortion would be completely illegal in Arizona at some point. What's problematic about all of this is that when you create this hostile environment with the target being people not being able to get abortions, it spills over into the lives of all pregnant people, especially people who are experiencing miscarriages and non-viable pregnancies. I, in my practice, have seen more and more people that I am treating for an ectopic pregnancy, which is a pregnancy outside of the uterus that is not going to survive and could kill the person carrying it. And these are people who have already had some type of interaction with another healthcare provider, oftentimes in an emergency room. And so when I first started Desert Star Family Planning, which was the clinic that I solo owned, I would generally, if I had a suspicion for that, I would send patients to the emergency room. And so under this new normal for us, seeing people haven't already either been to the emergency room or been to some other medical provider that I would have expected to have the knowledge to be able to make the accurate diagnosis, now realizing that the buck is stopping with me and saying to myself, well, thankfully, they wanted an abortion because they didn't even know that they had a pregnancy that could literally kill them if it went unnoticed and ruptured inside of them. And so that's very upsetting. It's frustrating. And the other piece of this that's happening is we already had a proliferation of these fake clinics, these crisis pregnancy centers. We're starting to call them anti-abortion centers, call them by what they are. And these people are doing ultrasounds that are not being done by trained people. They're not measuring anything. And now we're having more and more people having interactions with those centers first, and then coming in with completely empty uteruses and positive pregnancy tests. So, thankfully, the couple that I've seen ultimately had an intrauterine pregnancy and I performed an abortion. But imagine the people who are out there where that's not the case, where they're waiting to get care somewhere and they don't even have a pregnancy that is in the uterus. I am increasingly treating miscarriages as well. And that was something that was happening prior to Dobbs. But again, in Arizona was already a hotbed of anti-abortion restrictions. So we had already had an increasingly hostile situation for pregnant people. So prior, I was already seeing more and more miscarriages. And people who are like bouncing around from place to place, trying to get the care that they need. And they ultimately end up in an abortion clinic. And that's when they get served.
Well, speaking of court cases, this week a state court judge in Texas issued a temporary restraining order to allow a doctor to perform an abortion without facing civil or criminal penalties. The fetus was found to have trisomy 18, a genetic condition that typically leads to miscarriage or childbirth. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton immediately issued an appeal, and the lower court's ruling is now on hold. First, can you tell us more about trisomy 18? What lies ahead for Miss Cox, a mother of 2 young children and now 20 weeks pregnant?
Trisomy 18 is what we call a lethal abnormality, meaning that should this person make it to term in their pregnancy, there is going to be an immediate death of the fetus once it's born. And so this is generally a diagnosis that we that people are counseled to terminate their pregnancy for, because there is no chance of life for someone born with this condition. There have been some stories of some making it a few months or something like that. But that's a great toll to take on a family, and to know that this is something that it's not going to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so the mental anguish that and the potential physical impairment that can come from pregnancy, to for someone to carry a pregnancy where the child has no chance of life once it's born, is just cruel.
Yeah, and we should note that this is a wanted pregnancy. She has 2 children already. She envisioned having a larger family. She's even on record to say that she wouldn't normally seek out an abortion except for the lethality. What's the word? Yes.
We'll take it, lethality.
of the pregnancy.
These type of stories pull at our heartstrings, as they should. But when we are focusing on these exceptions for abortion bans, we are completely erasing the people who have abortions for the majority of reasons that people have abortions, which is they're pregnant and it's not the right time. Mm-hmm. And so when we focus on these type of stories, yes, they're tragic, but then what we also do is we create this narrative that there are good and bad abortions. And I see plenty of people in my practice of abortion for 22 years now who come into my office to say, I normally wouldn't do this, but you're there. And the reason that you're there is because I have the skills to provide that special abortion for you, because I've done hundreds of others who it wasn't the right time to be pregnant. So I have the skills I have to help you in your special wanted pregnancy situation that's lethal, because I also cared for several hundred more people who was the same gestation as you, and just it wasn't the right time to add to their family or start a family. And so when I'm asked about these type of situations, I always want to center the people who get left out of these conversations. What exceptions to bans do, they're there to make you feel better. They're not there to actually help people. Because as we're seeing playing across the country, people are not getting abortions for the exceptions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you a follow-up question to that point, which I think is a very important one. There's another court case in Texas. Last month, the Texas Supreme Court heard arguments in a broader lawsuit by women and doctors who seek clarification about the medical exemptions that would apply across the state. Is a legal strategy protecting medical exceptions to the abortion bans our only option to ensure abortion access? And if so, shouldn't we be fighting to end the abortion bans altogether?
I believe that we should be fighting to end bans altogether, because at the end of the day, viability is an individual evaluation of an individual pregnancy. We can arbitrarily pick a number of weeks and say, this is where viability is, because you're always going to have cases that fall outside of that. A 32-week brittle diabetic, a woman who has diabetes, uncontrolled the entire pregnancy, and she prematurely delivers at 32 weeks, the chance of survival for that baby looks a lot different than someone who had a completely healthy pregnancy and delivered at 32 weeks. Viability looks different depending on the circumstances of each pregnancy. The other issue is a lot of people believe that the trimester system is a medical construct. It was actually created by the Supreme Court when they gave the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. Mm-hmm. They legalized abortion across the country, but then they needed to balance the state's interest in perinatal life, and therefore it created the trimester system, so that then it invited the state to have an interest in a pregnant person's life beyond a certain stage of pregnancy. And then that got adapted by the medical industrial complex to be something that I was trained on. I didn't realize that it was a legal construct, honestly, until like maybe 2 to 3 years ago, because it was adopted into medical practice. And that makes me think about, with everything that's going on right now in this moment in time, what's going to get adopted into medical practice, where somebody 20 years later is going to be looking back and go, oh my gosh, that was because of all of these laws that got passed that we practice medicine this way now. And you have, as an act of resistance, OBGYNs across the country in these states where they can't fully practice what they learned and how to care for people and do their best for people, they're leaving. And I don't blame them.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you some questions about your medical training a little later, but to switch focus a little bit, you dedicate your book, Undue Burden, to your parents. How was abortion discussed in your family when you were a teenager?
So in my family, abortion wasn't discussed. And it's interesting because I think I hear how there are so many people now that are kind of feels like they're indoctrinated into the idea that abortion is bad. People going to, you see children being taken to protest clinics and getting class credit. And, in my childhood, it just wasn't even anything that was an issue. And I was raised Christian, the foundation of Christianity, and went to church and went to Bible study and, knew all the parables that children learn. But one thing that we did not really do is have a conversation about, honestly, we didn't talk about abortion. I really try to rack my mind about it. I will say, honestly, I didn't have a conversation with my mother about abortion until I had been an abortion provider for a good 10 years. And so, we have started having conversations about it. And honestly, why would a child know about abortion? What would be the reason that should even happen? And so this is when we think about the rhetoric and we think about all of this talk about, indoctrinating children, it really feels like it is the projection of what's actually happening on the other side, where, children are being exposed to things that really shouldn't even be something that they should be thinking about that early in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also write that there were ministers and pastors in your family, particularly on your mother's side, and you went to Bible study. Mm-hmm. You also describe yourself as a person of faith who prays scriptures with your patients. How do these spiritual conversations come about, and do most patients respond positively?
So for me, it is something that the patient brings up. So, but the thing is, when you create a container that if it's something that the patient cares about, then they have an opportunity to bring it into the encounter. So, for example, we have a worksheet that patients fill out. So there are keywords and phrases that someone would choose that would flag that one of the things that is part of the consideration of their decision is their faith. Mm-hmm. And so there are some kind of negative phrases that people can choose, like I'm afraid that people are going to judge me, or some other things like that. And so then when the conversation is going forth, then, it's like, tell me a little bit more about that. Mm-hmm. And so, the times that prayer has come into play is generally around the time that someone's getting ready to have a procedure. And the very first time that this happened was, I had a patient who was having a surgical abortion, and she asked me, did I believe in God? And I told her yes. And she asked me, would I pray for her? Mm-hmm. And so I just said yes. And so I took her hand and we closed our eyes, and whatever came to me, I prayed it. And she had this look of this peace came over her. And then the nurse gave her sedatives and we did the procedure. And I didn't really think about it. And so afterwards, I was talking to the nurse, and I was like, did that make you feel uncomfortable? And she said, no. And she said, and actually, the patient required less sedation. And I was like, oh, well, that's great. So other times it's, the patient initiated, like, can we pray together? Okay, fine, take the hand. And this one woman said such a good prayer. I told her, you can pray for me anytime. You're bringing the heavens down in here. So it's never anything that I've actually initiated, but because, and also too, I talk to other providers of faith, and I share that you don't necessarily have to broadcast it, but when you have faith, it's in you. It's a light. People see it. Like people identify you by who you are. So that's the other thing too. It's something that people are drawn to. So they, there is an energy that passes between. So, and people who are spiritual, I think, can get that.
Well, I think people are surprised, and certainly the anti-choice, anti-abortion protesters would not admit that 60% of abortions are provided to people of faith, including Catholics and evangelicals.
Yes. And so it is. So one of the things that, I put my banner up here because it's a controversial idea, right? That, we get to reclaim the moral high ground in the abortion debate, that these extremists do not speak for us. And ultimately, when someone like comes to me with a religious argument, then my response to them is, it's time for us to stop hurting each other in Jesus' name. Because it's not what we're supposed to do as Christians. We're supposed to believe that it's up to God to judge, and that people are working out their own salvation individually with Him. And so where you have interjected yourself into the situation, having an opinion, that's not actually what Christians are supposed to do.
Only 2.5% of medical doctors are Black women, and only 5% of U.S. physicians are Black overall. You completed an OBGYN training at King Drew Medical Center and complex family planning training at the University of Southern California. And you offer training to residents through the clinic and nonprofit. What are the institutional barriers experienced by Black physicians, especially those physicians wanting to provide abortion care and reproductive health?
Well, more recently, that Supreme Court decision that says affirmative action can no longer be used in admissions, that unfortunately we already see playing out in this current round of admissions. And that's really unfortunate, because it is already hard enough to, when you don't see yourself, when you don't see your future self, then how can you believe that you can achieve that? Like for me, I didn't see a Black physician until I went into student health in college, and there was a Black woman who saw me. And I asked her to be my mentor, and she was my mentor like for the rest of my we're still in touch to this day, because like, wow, I never saw that before. And so part of the obstacles that we face having providers of color is not having enough mentors for providers of color. And so so we have to be intentional about cultivating people of color to choose medicine. And that we've been having some really interesting conversations about this in certain forums of other Black physicians, that honestly, we have to start as early as elementary school, getting students of color interested in STEM, which is extremely difficult because you don't have a lot of schools in these communities that actually provide programs to enrich students of color to even believe that this is something that's possible for them. And so what we I mean, there is some truth to the fact that affirmative action is a band-aid in some sense, because the cultivation has to happen much earlier before that would come into play.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, though, when you take that away, we're reversing the progress that was made because of it. And quite honestly, white women benefited from affirmative action more than people of color did anyway. And so I think that what this is going to do for us is really start to have people think about, okay, so now what if we really believe that we want diversity and inclusion, and not just tokenism, then what programs are we actually going to put in place to be able to do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, a 2020 study showed that Black newborn babies in the United States are more likely to survive childbirth if they are cared for Black doctors, but 3 times more likely than white babies to die when looked after by white doctors. You write about an experience in your book, and I'd like maybe for you to share some experiences or conversations you'd have with patients, but why is it important for patients to see a Black physician and a Black woman physician?
Well, interestingly, there's also been studies that shows that if there are Black physicians in a community, the whole community does better. So I also find that very intriguing.
Yeah.
But I think that what we see is, so people say I'm not racist, right? Like that's the first thing somebody say, I'm not racist, right? But what we experience is a preference, right? So they're like white people prefer white people prefer Black people, Latin people prefer. I mean, so we know, so that is very important, and so considering that those biases exist, where your empathy for someone who looks like you is a certain way compared to people who don't look like you. And that's why we talk about inherent bias and we have to do all of these trainings and things. But what are people really doing with that, right? And so understanding the nature of human beings, then it becomes extremely important that at minimum, there should be enough providers that reflect the percentage of the population, for example, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if Black people make up 13% of the entire country's population, then there's been 13% of the doctors should be Black, right? And so we see that's not the case. And then if you're in the South, then that's a whole other situation, right?
Yeah.
If even more of the people are Black, then there should be more Black doctors here. But I think that what it really boils down to is just the empathy and the preference that we have for our own kind, so to speak. And honestly, I've seen it growing up with the few white people who grew up in my community. They have a preference, and it's for the people that they grew up with in their community. So I that's another important piece of this is that, having people from your community caring for the community. And that's also something that's very prevalent in the Black community. Like, for example, I was born, raised, and trained in Los Angeles. I plan to stay there, but some things that happen around opportunities move me out. But, you have a lot of, people of color who specifically become doctors because they want to take care of their community. Mm-hmm. And so that's another piece of it too.
Mm-hmm. In Louisiana, Black mothers die at 4 times the rate of white mothers. Yet in 2022, U.S. Senator Bill Cassidy, a physician representing Louisianans, chalked up this and other health disparities among Louisianans to genetics, clearly a racist trope. What does the research say about the social determinants of health? And can you explain weathering and its impact on patient health?
So, social determinants of health are conditions that are outside of the control of an individual that impacts their health. So some examples of this would be lack of access to nutritious food because of food deserts, lack of access to adequate transportation to get to and from doctor's appointments, for example. close proximity to toxic environment, toxic waste. So, you know, in, environmental racism shows us that many of these plants and things are situated in communities of color or low income communities. And so what happens is that then these things, number one, can directly impact people's health, like, for example, like breathing in toxins every day and children having asthma. And it can indirectly impact health because how can you be a true partner in your health when you can't even get to your doctor's appointments? Mm-hmm. Right. And so then you have, or you're a diabetic who can't get access to nutritious food. Right? And so then you have, so this idea of weathering is that there are, and these conditions are linked to racism and poverty. And sometimes it's poverty and sometimes it's racism and sometimes it's both. But weathering is how our bodies change over the course of time due to the stress from these factors that we can't control that are impacting our bodies. And so this term was first created back in, I want to say I'm drawing a blank, I do have it in my book. I wrote exactly who created the term and when, but it's been expounded upon by other scholars, and it is generational too. So like there is a scientific explanation that certain aspects of our genetic makeup is changed. And that also can get passed down from generation to generation. And so we have the higher impact of diabetes and cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure and all these things concentrated in the Black community where we have these disparities, and weathering is a very big part of it. So when it comes to maternal mortality, then you have Black people who are already sicker before pregnancy, and then the toll of pregnancy that then increases their risks for death, as well as mistreatment by the medical system due to racism.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing all that playing out right here in in New Orleans and Louisiana and across the South and around the country, actually.
Yes.
You argue that reproductive justice, a framework coined by American Black women in 1994, shifts the conversation from abstract rights espoused by the pro-choice movement to everyday justice. Can you expound on what you mean by everyday justice? How does the shifting the narrative from reproductive rights to reproductive justice protect abortion access?
So the reproductive rights framework is a very individualistic framework. It's my body, my choice. And my body, my choice ignores that health behavior is influenced by social interactions in the home, relationships, community. All of these things have an impact on people's healthcare decisions. And so when we apply a justice lens to reproductive health, then what we're doing is we are acknowledging that these are not just individual decisions that people are making about their health, that there are intersections with other parts of their lives that are being taken into consideration. Mm-hmm. And so what reproductive justice is an intersectional theory that says that we need to pay attention to all the intersecting oppressions or marginalizations that are happening with people that are influencing their decision making. And so that is a way forward, I believe, when we're talking about restoring and expanding people's access to abortion, because what it does is it takes this singular focus off of abortion. Because, and I'll give you an example about this. So I had a woman come in, and if she continued the pregnancy, she would be having her 5th child. Mm-hmm. And she already is struggling. And one of her children has pretty significant mental and emotional disability. And so she's already feeling like she's neglecting the other 3 kids for the one that has the special needs.
Uh-huh.
And she's really concerned about bringing a 5th child to, into her family. But she's really torn up over this abortion decision. And so when I'm talking with her, my question is, so let's just not even think about abortion. Do you feel that you should have a 5th child with everything that you've explained to me? And she said no. And so I'm like, well, let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because then the solution is that in order for you not to have this 5th child, then you're going to have an abortion, right? And so like going back and like kind of peeling that away and applying a lens to this, like, you want to be the best mom you can be to the children you already have. Yeah. And having this 5th one is not going to allow you to do this. And so that's a just and moral decision to make about your family.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that puts the abortion in a different frame for you. And so I think that is really important because people literally, it's such a trigger.
Yes.
It immediately, people shut down. They don't want to think about it. They won't want to talk about it because you said the word abortion. So much so that there are people who believe that if a person decides they want to have an abortion, they should get one. But they're so afraid to say the word abortion because the way it triggers people. And so reproductive justice allows us to have conversations in a way where you can really start to think about, well, what do you feel is just in this situation of your life? There have been people now since Dobbs where they're older, they might have some medical conditions, under a different environment, they might give pregnancy a shot. But they also know that their health could go wrong. There could be some type of genetic issue because they're older, and they know that they may not be able to have an abortion should that those things happen, and they have the decision to make, and that decision won't be there for them. And so in that moment, what's just for them is to terminate the pregnancy now before they even get to a point where they have to sacrifice their life for the well-being of the baby that's going to be born because they won't be able to get an abortion. Mm-hmm. So that is, for me, why I think the reproductive justice framework is helpful and is definitely going to move us a lot further than holding on to this idea of my body, my choice.
Well, those are really good examples of how the reproductive justice framework appears in your clinic, but how do those principles and values appear or manifest themselves in your community work?
So one of the things that's important is that we understand that what we're really dealing with here is reproductive oppression. And reproductive oppression is a means to control controlling, and I'm going to say women, because in general, that's the goal, is to control women's fertility as a means to control entire communities. And so there are so many ways that reproductive oppression occurs, and it's not just in terms of impacting whether someone can have an abortion or not. So we're looking at, forced sterilization. We're talking about coercive contraception practices. We're talking about mass incarceration, with women being the increasingly incarcerated and Black women bearing the disproportionate brunt of incarceration of women. What happens to families when you jail the mom? What happens to pregnant women in prison? Like, we're starting to see these stories about people delivering their babies alone in their cells and these type of things. We look at violence, and not just intimate partner violence, but violence in general. We're seeing more women and girls being involved in violence. We're seeing it play out where police are beating up women, Black women. And so, like, all of these things are interconnected. These are experiences that are happening in people's lives that is influencing their decision making about their futures. And part of someone's future is whether they're going to start or expand in a family. And so when you start to think about all of the things that the oppressions that people are facing, then it ultimately does come back to people's reproduction. There's a growing generation of people who are saying, I don't want to bring children into this world.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today here at Blue Cypress Books. And if you're joining us online, or for those in the audience, I want to reintroduce you. It's Dr. Deshawn Taylor, an Arizona-based award-winning gynecologist and family planning specialist and author of Undue Burden, a Black woman physician on being Christian and pro-abortion in the reproductive justice movement. We have a few minutes left, and so I want to ask if there are any questions from the audience. Anyone have a question? I think many of the folks in the audience are your family members who have joined us, and so they probably know a lot about your work and you personally, obviously. I have one last question, and it is in regards, as you talked a little bit about the violence, and I want to ask you specifically about the violence at the clinics. The National Abortion Federation issued a report about the growing violence at abortion clinics, including increased stalking, blockades, suspicious packages, and invasion. Have you or your staff experienced any of the sort of violence at the clinic in the last year? And how are you planning to deal with that as we move forward, as there are fewer and fewer clinics and the violence is concentrated in the few remaining clinics in states where abortion is available?
So one of the things that I thought that was that over time, with my clinic existing longer, that there would be protesters, but my clinic, Desert Star, doesn't have protesters. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. One, a lot of the anti-abortion movement is hyper-focused on Planned Parenthood, and that is unfortunate. But the other piece of this is why are people protesting and invading clinics? Some of it is access to patients, and some of it is actually outing providers. So there are a lot of abortion providers who provide abortion in the shadows. And so I am a public-facing abortion provider. So there's less incentive for someone to harass me. Now, I have had credible threats that have not been taken lightly, but the best defense is offense. So that the fact that I'm out kind of takes some of the wind from that sail. And the other thing is access to patients. And so, one thing that I've been very, very intentional about is how, the location of the clinic and how patients enter and leave. And not necessarily creating a fortress where people feel afraid. It's like, oh my God, like why is all this here? But actually creating ways and seeing and taking care of people in a way where they're not, for example, lines out the door of the clinic, for example, where folks can just actually walk up and harass patients. Or, having a location where people have to walk through, walk from a long ways where protesters can line up and have access to them on their way into the clinic. And some of that stuff can't be avoided, but I think some of it is not designed with what the patient would potentially experience in mind too. And so I think that people can do a better job of that. But one of the things with seeing this escalation of violence post-op lets us know is that it's really not about this mantle that people have taken up for the unborn. It's really about the community that has formed and been radicalized around abortion. And so whether, it's now about peer credit and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's become this idea that people belong to this group, and they want to get their cookies for doing all the things that go along with being a member of this group. And that is when you realize that that's very dangerous, right? And so these anti-abortion extremists are being linked to Christian extremists, and we also know that these Christian extremists have an agenda that includes LGBTQ people in all kinds of things that go against the traditional family. So once you start to make those connections, and in that these values are enforced with violence, then as long as these people continue to be amplified, then the violence is going to continue to worsen.
Well, that is a sobering note to end on, and I wish you all the best in Phoenix, and certainly as you travel the country, and the best of luck to you in selling this very important book.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think that, as I was writing the book, it was therapeutic for me because I was writing it during the time that, Roe was crumbling. And so once I finished it, I realized that this is something that is very special. And the feedback that I've gotten about it is that no matter where you are in the movement, whether you're a babe or you're a seasoned person in the movement, it meets you where you are and moves you along in your understanding. And that's what I want to see happen, because what needs to happen is there needs to be a radical paradigm shift in how people are thinking and talking about abortion, because people are not making a decision to end pregnancies in a vacuum. They're making a decision in the context of their entire lives. And so because people aren't singularly focused on whether they're going to have an abortion or not, we as advocates need to not be singularly focused on that either. Mm-hmm. Reproductive justice helps us look at a broader picture.
Well, Undue Burden, a Black women physician on being Christian and pro-abortion in the reproductive justice movement, is available here at Blue Cypress Books and also online for purchase. And there'll be signed copies here at this bookstore very, very shortly. So thank you again for joining us, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.